Hello, it is me again, your main host, Felix. So, we're having another little guest episode this week, whilst Melisa is away in America, and me and Shira have a little rest. So, for this week, I'm going to do something a little bit different, and instead of being a typical podcast, you're going to get to hear a little bit of a podfic. So this is going to be the first few chapters of Bram Stoker's Hannibal, which is an absolutely incredible endeavour by D.B. Mars to rewrite the entirety of Bram Stoker's Dracula as a Hannibal AU. It's legitimately mind-blowing how huge an endeavour this piece of work is. It is a legitimate novel. It's huge and it's wonderfully written, it's incredibly fun, it's romantic, it's violent, it's sad, it's everything. It really is. You might notice that it hasn't been updated in a little while, the podfic version, because I've been very unwell, but there will be updates coming soon, I promise. So, yeah, I wanted to show off, I guess, a collaboration with DB's just incredible hard work and my much less incredible little bit of work doing some of the narration. So if you like Victorian British masculine voices and bad Russian, then I highly encourage you to keep listening. And you can listen to some cheeky fiction to get you started on your day. I hope you enjoy, and next week we will be back with an actual episode of Fate and Circumstance. I love you all, and I shall see you soon. Bye-bye. Bram Stoker's Hannibal, written by D.B. Mars, read by Fanfaron. Act 1, Chapter 1. Enriched by the blood of men. Transylvania, 1462. My lips are numb from constant prayer, my tongue dry and leaden in my mouth. Beyond the chapel walls I hear the clamouring of my soldiers, the beat of our war drums. The cacophony of righteousness reverberates through me, a thrumming heartbeat that no doubt rattles the bones of my ancestors that rest in the crypt below. I open my eyes and rest my gaze on the placid face of the suffering Christ where he hangs on the crucifix above the gilded altar. I search for such a certain peace, repeating my vows to the Almighty. Even if we should fail, if I should die, it would be in holy combat, and I would be reunited with my family in the kingdom of heaven. Death would not be death, but an everlasting reward. But we shall not fail. We cannot. Constantinople has fallen. The fate of Christendom hangs in the balance. The lectors and those they lead must prevail against the unholy hordes. Father Davy's hand touches my bent head with trembling, reverential fingers. It is time. I stand with a rustle of armour and turn away from the altar, letting him lead me through the candle-strewn chapel to join my sister near the doors. She is strapped into armour of her own, sleeker and lighter than what I wear, though each of us display the stag's head pauldrons and the Lecter family crest on our chest plates. Her shield maidens finish plaiting her long ash-blonde hair, wrapping it around her head before lowering her helmet into place. A gentle wave of my hand and the maidens scatter. My sister regards me with our mother's cool grey eyes as I help her with her quiver and place her bow in her hand. "Hannibal," she says, her voice gentle but resolute. "Smile, brother. Soon the very earth will turn red with heathen blood." "God willing," I say. Misha gives me a playful little shove. "I wager I'll slay more Turks than you." "Nothing would please me more." Our parents died when we were young. I have always felt, in some ways, more like Misha's parent than her sibling. If she surpasses my skills in battle, it would bring me a father's pride. I have taught her everything I know about the arts of war, though I have always prayed to the gracious God above that she would not have to use them. The forces of evil have said otherwise. At dawn, we ride for the borderlands to defend our homes and our faith. My attendant brings me my sword and buckles the sheath to my waist. Father Davies blesses us one last time. "May your sword," he says to me, "burn with the holy fire of Archangel Michael, the same holy fire that drove the serpent back into the pit." To Misha, "May your arrows strike true, as though they fly on the wings of angels, casting our enemies into the fires of hell." He anoints each of us with oil to seal his words. It is the final act of preparation. I can delay no longer. I feel the resolute hand of God guiding me, and the fear leaves my heart. There is only one thing that could make me hesitate, that could shake the iron grip on my sword as I leave my family's castle, perhaps forever. A sight that would make me want to turn my back on this holy mission. And before we leave, the doors part just enough for him to step in and stand before me. Ilya. His eyes are red-rimmed and hollow, but for the moment he does not weep. Instead, he offers me a brave smile and steps forward to clasp my hand where it is encased in my gauntlet. He's wearing his bedclothes, one of my embroidered dressing gowns flung over it. Too big on him, it hangs free on one shoulder. My husband, my beautiful boy, my dearest treasure. My bridegroom, prized above all else. We said our goodbyes last night. I thought it best not to see him before dawn, lest I abandon God's holy quest to rid the land of the Muslim Turks and flee with him instead. We would live in some obscure forest, he and I, with no regard for the rest of the world or the Almighty, and I would die a happy man. The shape of his mouth and the flush of his cheek make me weak enough to imagine breaking my Christian vows. But he is here now, and I cannot help but embrace him, wishing with every fibre of my heart that there was not a steel breastplate between us. Misha touches Ilya's shoulder. Her fingers are bare for arrows, and I am envious of them as they brush his trembling curls behind his ear. "Take heart, my friend," she says. "We'll see you in a few weeks." God keep you, Misha. He leans away from me just long enough to kiss her cheek, and Misha and the priest leave us to say goodbye yet again. "I should go with you," Ilya implores for the final time, looking at me with his blue eyes, more beautiful to me than any sapphire or topaz they may resemble. "Please, Hannibal, let me come. If we're to be destroyed, I want to die at your side." "No, beloved," I whisper against his ear, inhaling the fresh scent of the mountain air from his dark brown hair. "Someone has to stay. If Misha and I fail, you and your men are our last hope for our villagers. Keep them safe in the castle until reinforcements arrive. If the Turks do make it past our forces, woe to them. My Ilya and his elite guard are fierce and quick, armed with daggers that flash like lightning and crossbows with bolts thick enough to impale a skull through a helmet. While I trained Misha to fight, there were many things we both learned when Ilya came to Castle Lecter. Once, on the way to visit a neighbouring boyar, bandits overtook our party, outnumbering our guards 3-1. One of the most treasured memories I hold is that of Ilya leaping from his horse to stab a highwayman through the neck, rolling to his feet to fling a dagger into the throat of another. My clever, vicious boy. I trust him above all others with the safety of Castle Lecter and its inhabitants. "Please," he begs, one final attempt to sway me. I kiss him for what could be the last time, softly at first, then with unrestrained passion. I pour all of my love for him into prayers for his safety, a constant litany in my mind. "Ilya, I love you more than anything else on earth or even in heaven. It is heresy to say, but it is true, and I only hope God forgives me. Hannibal, come back to me." He at last steps out of my embrace. "I'll wait here for you." He is weeping again, though I can see him trembling as he attempts to remain brave-faced. "I will defend our home. When I miss you, I'll write my thoughts on parchment and seal them away until you return." "Be sure to write down your dreams." I cannot stop the tears of my own. Every morning we tell one another what we dreamed of the night before. All of my dreams will be of you, he chokes out before letting a series of sobs slip out. He puts his hands over his face and turns from me. God will protect us. It is the most arduous feat I have ever attempted in my blessed years on this earth, but I manage to open the chapel door and step out into the pale dawn. My warriors roar my name as I mount my horse and join Misha in the centre of the courtyard. Together, we gallop away toward our destiny, the fulfillment of our sacred duty. The battle stretches over days, pausing only when it is too dark to fight. One night there is a moon so full we can continue. Swords flash, gleaming with cold light, the black blood upon their blades, on the faces of friend and foe alike. I have always felt that each death I bring about should be fully experienced, honoured with my complete attention. In war, this is not possible. Though I allow myself little moments to enjoy a slit throat, the gleam of disbelief in an enemy's eyes as I run him through, the way a head bounces just so when separated from the shoulders of a man who thought God was on his side. Perhaps he is. So many Christians fall to heretic blades. Misha and I spend precious time away from the fray, attempting to coordinate and strategize with the forces we have left. Misha thinks of the crows that often circle the tower at Castle Lecter, how one of them will pretend to be wounded to distract perceived threats from discovering their nests. We devise our plan and dispatch the messengers to bring word of it to our captains. Before we return to battle, I stop her. She pauses, looking at me with an unspoken question. I reach beneath my breastplate and remove the golden crucifix beneath, the one engraved with words of love from my father and given to my mother. I have never coveted anything, considered it a treasure, except for this one piece of my parents I have worn every day since they died. Hannibal, she protests as I lift it to slip it over her head. It is one thing if God is with us today, I say. It is another kind of comfort to know that mother and father walk with us as well. They would be so proud of you, Misha. She presses her mouth together into a crooked smile that I know is working against her tears. An embrace, and she is gone, back to her archers on the western ridge. Despite the odds, our gambit is successful. Though we have lost many of our finest Christian warriors, the Turks are routed, leaderless. We take as many prisoners as we can, and as the remaining troops assemble before me, I raise a large golden crucifix handed to me by one of my lieutenants. God be praised, we are victorious! But even as we celebrate and praise God and Christ, there is a rippling unease in the air. At last, one of Misha's shield maidens finds me in the crowd. You must come quickly. My heart is ice as I follow her swiftly across the churned, bloody earth to a tent below the western ridge. I tear open the flaps to find Misha stretched out on a blanket, surrounded by weeping women. They pray and cross themselves. The healers have withdrawn. They know the sword wound is mortal. Even now, I can barely see the rise and fall of her chest. Her face is still, but rigid with agony. I am frozen, staring down at her, unable to breathe or speak, cursed into a state of immobilized, perfect presence, where I memorize the tiny details of her. The mole on her neck, the way small strands of her hair over her ears always escape her braids, the shape of her face that still contains the features she had as a child. The shield maidens quickly strip me of my armour. Still, I cannot move. I am reminded of the nights spent at her bedside, rocking her when she had nightmares of our parents' demise. She would not quiet for any nurse or servant, even for our Uncle Robertus or Aunt Murasaki. This expression she wears now is a replica of the one she wore when she was inches away from waking with a screech and bursting into tears. And so, I do now what I did then. I hold her. I rock her. I whisper that everything will be all right, that the dawn is coming. And as she did when she was young, her face and body relax into a comforted sleep. She goes still in my arms. She was waiting for you, one of the maidens whispers. You'll meet again one day in heaven, another promises. I must allow her platitudes to comfort me at this moment. I have men to lead, and prisoners to question. I will let my heart break another day, when I have the leisure. 3 days later, I'm in the middle of smashing a Turk's fingers one at a time when a burning sensation comes over my entire body. I leave the interrogation tent and plunge into the woods, ordering back the men who follow to discover the reason for my hasty exit. I fall to my knees at the edge of a stream and splash the water on my face in an attempt to make the burning stop. It does, but the feeling is replaced by the sensation of drowning. I gasp for air, darkness feathering my vision. I lose consciousness and wake with the feeling that time has passed. My body is cold, limbs leaden, and I am sure that something is wrong at Castle Lecter. Ilya. Returning to camp, I call my captains to me. We depart in minutes with hastily packed saddlebags and ride hard for home. We are forced to stop after nightfall. The clouds over the moon and the road into the mountains is too treacherous to navigate by torchlight. I do not sleep. My mind is nothing but feverish prayers in his name. Ilya, Ilya, Ilya. The very second the grey fingers of pre-dawn light the way, we are off, making our way through the Borgo Pass. At last, the jagged towers of Castle Lecter are in sight. I expected to see smoke, hear the screams and metallic clangs of battle, some part of the Turkish force having broken through the line to attack my keep, but everything is eerily silent. The shutters closed, no one about. Reba, Ilya's closest friend and Castle Lecter's herbalist, is waiting for me in the courtyard, walking stick in hand. She knows the sound of my steps and reaches for me, drawing me into a tight embrace after the bow of deference. "My lord," she says softly, "there are no words to express my sorrow." "My sister died valiantly," I say, my heart still beating against its iron cage like an agitated animal. "Lady Misha has fallen?" Time slows, stops. I clutch her by her thin shoulders. "Ilya?" "He thought he'd lost you." "Where is my husband?" My question is uttered with soft, disbelieving rancour. "In the chapel," she whispers. I release her and hurry to the double doors, pushing them both open in one motion. The castle's household and Ilya's guard are gathered in the pews. Father Davies walks slowly down the aisle, swinging the sacred incense. Those gathered speak in hushed tones or pray softly on their knees. Echoes of gentle weeping in different cadences. All go silent when I step over the threshold. Every eye finds me as I force my feet forward, one step after the next, my breath burning in my lungs. All I hear is the thud of my heart and footsteps fleeing into silence. Ilya is stretched out on a bier in front of the altar. He is dressed in the soft white tunic and tooled leather belt he wore for our wedding. He looks so small there, flowers strewn over his chest, his hands fastened together with a white ribbon over his stomach, hair carefully combed, glossy in the candlelight. His lashes rest blackly against his pale cheeks. I appreciate the attempts, but there is no illusion here, no softening of the truth. Ilya, my beloved husband, is dead. I want to scream. I cannot. If I did, I would never stop. It sounds like a wild, sweet release, but I can make no sound. All I can do is go to him. Even as I pull him up from the bier, scattering flowers, holding him into my arms, I can smell death. I know I weep, but still, I make no sound. There are no words. Reba has always been the wisest of us. Not even a melody of sobs would truly give voice to this loss. Gradually, I become aware that the chapel has emptied. The stained glass windows have gone dark with the cloak of night. Only Father Davies and Reba remain, the latter lingering at the back of the chapel near the doors. I gently replace my husband's corpse on the bier and arrange the flowers once more. In the candlelight, through the veil of my tears, I can pretend for a moment that he looks like he is sleeping. "The Turk shot an arrow into his chamber," Reba explains, her voice echoing against the painted walls depicting the Stations of the Cross, Mary holding her dead son. "There was a letter boasting that you'd been slain. Inside was this. I turned towards the sound of jingling metal. Reba is holding my mother's crucifix, the one I'd given Misha. The enemy stole it from her as she lay dying and used it against me in the cruelest way the universe could imagine. He flung himself into the river from the tower window. Count Lecter, I wish he would have let me speak with him. I was pounding on the chamber door, but... She lets her words hang, thin and ragged in the air like winter clouds. I turn away and reach out to stroke Ilya's hair, smoothing down a chestnut curl. You will see him again, Reba insists. He will meet you at the gates of heaven. No, Father Davies contradicts her. I slowly lower my hand to my lap where I kneel at Ilya's side. I turn my face and look up at the priest. His eyes are sad, but his mouth is set in a determined line that hints at the kind of reluctant cruelty. Your husband destroyed himself, he says. He took his own life. His soul is damned, Count Lecter. The silent rings, heavy and clear, a clarion bell, and I break. I can feel my very soul rending, tearing at the seams as something burst forth from within it. What emerges is a dagger of pure understanding. God is beyond measure in wanton malice, and matchless in his irony. He sent a storm to kill my parents at sea, crafting waves so high they overturned their ship. He left Misha in my care, only to have her die in my arms. His holy symbol, worn for decades against my heart, now used to trick my beloved Ilya. God has taken everything from me. He has left me entirely barren. I, who led an army in defence of his church, who defeated the heathens that would usurp Christendom, this is how I am repaid. Death and unending loneliness are what I reap, despite what I have sown in good faith. I get to my feet and draw my sword from its sheath. My heart roars, shrieks, screams, wails the words, but my mouth only growls them, my voice steady. I renounce God. Father Davies recoils, moving away from me on tottering steps, nearly tripping on his cassock. Count Lecter, he stutters, why do you blaspheme so? I renounce God. I call my new vow up to the placid face of Christ on the cross as he looks down on my Ilya, one of God's most perfect creatures, with unmasked disdain. I will rise from my own death and avenge his with all the powers of darkness. No, Father Davies crosses himself frantically. In stepping away from me, he trips and sprawls out on a pew. Stop, he begs. God took everything from me, I snarl, gazing down at the rotting piece of meat that was once my dearest treasure. So I will take souls from him and turn them over to the devil, and I will kill in my own name, never again in his. Compelled by a force I cannot name or describe, I slash my sword against the belly of the crucifix. Blood pours forth as though I had gutted a living man. I could feel its warmth radiating towards me as it spurts down onto the altar, filling the communion chalice. I can smell the sharp metallic tang. Faintly, I can hear Father Davies praying, sobbing out the words, each dripping with terror. I lean over Ilya's body and lift the cup from the altar. Raising it to my lips, I drink. The world goes black, then red. A pain unlike anything I've ever felt consumes each bone in my body, each organ, infects my living blood and humours alike. With a strangled cry, I fall next to Ilya, writhing in torment as my veins fill with fire. I feel each bone in my body break and snap together again in a seemingly endless series of agonizing, explosive cracks. My mouth fills with my own blood as something sharp slashes over my tongue. And then the pain is gone, all of it. I open my eyes and stand easily, with a liquid grace reserved for a much younger man. The dim chapel is somehow now brightly lit, though the smattering of candles sputter weakly on either side of the altar. I can see everything. Every chip in the mural's paint, every vein in the petals of Elia's flowers. I can smell even more sharply now the rot consuming my beloved, and I can hear Father Davy's heart in his chest clear as the church bell tolls. That heartbeat calls to me as it races, rabbit-like. The priest scrambles off the pew and runs for the door. Expending no energy at all, I have caught him, hands twisted in his cassock, pressing him against the chapel door, lifting him now like he weighs nothing. "God save me!" he chokes through a terrified sob. He flails about, and the beads of his rosary touch my face. I hiss as they burn my flesh, as though the simple wooden strand was white hot. My response is to tear his arm from its socket. It comes free easily, like removing a leg from a roasted pheasant. He howls. Blood pours onto the stones below. Blood. It calls to me. I am consumed with a burning thirst I cannot name, but I sate it for a moment by licking his blood from my fingers. I tear into his throat. My teeth are unnaturally long and sharp. I feel them extend from my gums as I drink the hot life, a communion directly from his veins. It splatters all over my tunic, soaks me from neck to feet, and flows through me, satiating the thirst and bringing me the quietude of perfect bodily satisfaction. I can feel his blood feeding the essence of vitality that stems from some unnatural spring in my heart. My heart, I realize as I drop his lifeless body to the floor, no longer beats. I look at my hands, stained in red, then touch the unnatural teeth before they retract into my skull. I do not know what I have become, but I know what I am not. I am no longer a child of God. I am something else entirely, and all I want is more. Bram Stoker's Hannibal, written by D.B. Mars, read by Fanfarin. Chapter 2. Not by any means comforting. Will Graham woke to the rustling of newspaper pages. The quiet birth of the train had lulled him to sleep again, and, judging by the light, a few hours had passed. The Hungarian countryside rolled along outside the window, full of fertile curves, rows of spring flowers, and herds of cattle and sheep. He'd been alone in the train car when they'd pulled out of the station in Vienna, but he'd apparently been joined by a man and a woman who were now seated opposite. The man had a newspaper open and was hidden behind it, and the woman's face was obscured with a veil that draped down from her hat in thick folds. Will took a moment to remove his Homburg and run his fingers through his hair. He passed a hand over his eyes with a small sound of weariness, then replaced his hat on his head. In the moments immediately following, a sense of unease blossomed inside him. The man and the woman had not moved. The train was still rolling along, but he could barely detect the comforting rocking motion of the wheels on the tracks, and the cabin had gone preternaturally quiet. A strange dread soaked into Will's pores through the very atmosphere itself as the shadows outside grew long. "Do you have the time?" he blurted, a flailing attempt to break whatever spell it was that gathered and settled over his heart, sinking into the depths of his chest. "Of course, love." The woman lifted a watch on a chain around her neck and whipped up her veil to examine it. Will recoiled as he recognised the mutilated face of Catherine Eddowes, carved to pieces by the Ripper, her wounds bloody, the white bones of her face exposed where the flesh had been sliced away. 6:30, she chirped with a cheerful nod that splattered thick drops of red down onto her dress. The passenger at her side lowered his paper with a little crinkling sound. It was Abel Gideon, the man the newspapers called the Whitechapel Murderer and Leather Apron, before settling on the moniker coined by Winifred Lowndes, Jack the Ripper. He too was dead, body riddled with bullets fired from Will's revolver, his eyes sunken, pale blue and cloudy with rot. "Time passes so quickly in good company, don't it, Inspector?" Catherine grinned at him with her mutilated lips. Will felt his entire body clench in horror and revulsion as she leaned closer, dribbling blood down the front of her dress. "Give us a kiss," she rasped, bloody spittle flying from the ruins of her mouth. Will woke up. Again. The train car was empty. His breaths came in little sobbing pants, and he was slicked with sweat, collar wilted and hair damp. He cursed under his breath and withdrew his handkerchief to dab at his face, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. He hadn't had a dream about Gideon in a while, since Christmas at least. He'd found a kind of peace in having a head full of real estate law instead of crime scenes and corpses. Here he was, on his way to perform his first official duties as certified solicitor, and his mind had somehow been reinfected by the grisly images he tried so hard to forget. It had to be the time change, the uncomfortable nights of sleep, the foreign food. Will hesitated for a solid minute before drawing the small leather-bound journal from his jacket pocket and making a short entry. 2nd of May, 1893. Dream. Gideon and Eddowes fell asleep on train to Budapest. He exhaled slowly, tucking the book and his pencil back in his pocket, unease settling over him like a thick, furry mantle. Putting it down in writing made it real. It had been so long. Why now? He left the cabin and walked the length of the car a few times before returning to his seat. The countryside had given way to a lovely city full of stately stone buildings, lush park spaces, and soaring cathedrals. He gathered his satchel and small travelling bag and disembarked when the train came to a stop. It was early afternoon, and the weather was fair, a soft wind blowing over the gentle waters of the Danube. Will didn't stray far from the station. He had another train to catch. But after sitting so long, he was desperate to explore, crossing bridges over the river and taking his time circling the Parliament building. As he walked through the streets and let his eyes linger on the foreign majesty of Budapest, the dream eroded piece by piece. He stumbled across a line of shops near the train station that catered to tourists, and paused when he saw a beautifully embroidered shawl hanging in one of the windows. It was white, with floral patterns in various shades of blue, its design rustic, but idyllically beautiful. The blues reminded him of Alana's eyes, depending on what colour dress she wore. He had his hand on the shop's doorknob before chastising himself and stepping away. That was the kind of gift a man bought for a woman receiving his romantic attentions. It was an overture, and Alana had made it very clear there was to be none of that. The way I am isn't compatible with the way you are. 11 words and 3 silences that bore the weight of their entire history together up until that very moment. And the part that hurt the most was that she was right. The way Alana was, the only child of a prominent London family with royal connections, set to inherit the estate, beautiful and revered by high society, everyone frothing at the mouth to see who she would marry, was not compatible with the way Will was. The way he was. Foundling. American. No pedigree. Despite having left Scotland Yard, much of his mind was still wrapped up in a world of murder, his sanity and conscience the Ripper's final victims. He was tainted by that case, and the mark couldn't be washed away, like Christ's blood on Pilate's palm. Silly of him, really, to think he had a chance. Such a wild, childish notion that if they cared about one another enough, their circumstances could be overcome, that love would find a way. Their lives weren't some fairy tale, and when he'd kissed her before leaving for Transylvania, the way lovers kiss, Alana had been the voice of reason, her good sense prevailing and putting a stop to it. Will bought a postcard of Budapest's Parliament building instead, and returned to the train station. That evening, in Klassenberg, he wrote on it by candlelight, huddled close to the hearth in the inn's common room. Dear Alana, I feel I've left the West and entered the East. I'll spend tonight at the Hotel Royal. For supper, I had a dish called paprika hendel, chicken with red peppers. For breakfast, they serve a maize flour porridge called mamaliga. Budapest was fascinating. I think you'd like it. I've read that every superstition in the world is gathered in the horseshoe of the Carpathians. I'll let you know which ones are most prominent, as they interested you during my research. I am well, and will write when I arrive in Bistritz. Will. A short note, deceptively simple. It took him almost 2 hours to write, mentally composing and then erasing what he'd written over and over again. I'm sorry I kissed you. I'm not sorry I kissed you. If you recall, when we were 9, you kissed me first. I apologize for attempting to change the nature of our relationship. Please know that from now on, I will only think of you as a sister. Do you remember the summer? We were 13. You kissed me in the garden on 6 separate occasions. In the back of the sleigh when we visited the Alps, 15 years old that time. When we went on holiday in Brittany and you tried too many ciders. We were 22 then. And once more before I left to become a bobby. Can you blame me for trying again? Why don't you love me? Why can't you? I'm not an inspector anymore. It's been 5 years since the Ripper. I'm a solicitor now. I'm not unstable. Your father is dead. I know he told you I was an unsuitable match, but he's gone. You're going to inherit Hillingham and everything else. Why does it matter? Will read and reread his benign message, then gave it to the hotel clerk to mail for him. He went up to his little room and tried to sleep. It was a long time in coming, and could only be coaxed along by some of the whiskey he'd packed. The next day, the train seemed to dawdle through the countryside. Will hardly minded. The window afforded him picturesque views of the rustic beauty that rolled slowly past. Sometimes there were little towns or castles on the top of steep hills, or thick, shimmering rivers snaking through the fertile fields. At every station there were groups of people, sometimes crowds, in all sorts of attire. Some wore familiar farming garb, but others were decked in a kind of peasant dress, more typical, Will assumed, of the region, full, white-sleeved blouses and thick belts trailing ribbons. Some he recognised from lithographs as Slovaks with wide-brimmed hats, enormous studded leather belts, and heavy black moustaches. He let his mind settle into a calm place of observation, and the time passed as easily as he catalogued what he saw, making notes in his journal every so often. His reverie was broken only by noticing the things that made him instinctively wish he could tell Alana about them. Thinking of her stung him in a way he couldn't quite describe. She'd made him feel damaged, defective. All her reasons were sound enough, her father's wishes, their societal differences, what others would say, but beneath them was an ugly current of truth, what she'd said without doing him the courtesy of actually saying it. There was something wrong with him. There had always been. And while it had, perhaps, been droll or pitiable or sweet when they were growing up, now it was an insurmountable flaw. He never should have told her how he'd managed to catch the Ripper, how he'd abandoned his own mind to empathise with a monster. Foolish. He'd thought she'd have been proud of him for putting 6 bullets in Dr. Abel Gideon as he stood over Mary Kelly's body. Will shook his head violently, then got up and paced the cabin before stalking the length of the car a few times to clear his mind. It took time, but he was eventually able to repress the memory of what he'd seen that day in the little rented room where Kelly had been brutally murdered. It was on the dark side of twilight when he arrived in Bistritz. It was a liminal place, right on the border of true wildness, and lived in a transient realm between life and death. Everywhere were people, walking home with parcels, sitting in cafes, speaking their native language over the tolling of church bells. Will knew from his research before the journey that all of this life existed, persisted, where death had run rampant. Many of the buildings were newer constructions, compared to the ancient wonders of Budapest. This was due to a series of fires 50 years ago, 5 of them, in fact. At the very beginning of the 17th century, the settlement had undergone a siege and lost 13,000 people, the casualties of the war proper assisted by famine and disease. So it was everywhere, Will thought, the living dancing on the graves of the dead. Even now, sex workers led their customers along the same alleys where the Ripper's victims had met their fate. One day, there would be something new over the tenement where Mary Kelly had been carved up like so much meat. In Bistritz, however, the past seemed closer. He could feel it jutting out stubbornly into the living world. He found the Golden Crone Hotel easily enough, an old-fashioned tavern and inn right out of Chaucer. As he neared the door, a woman in a traditional white blouse with a kindly weathered face greeted him. "They're here Englishmen?" she asked, reaching for his hand with her soft wrinkled ones. Will nodded. "Will Graham," he said. Not worth mentioning, of course, that he wasn't English by birth. It wouldn't matter to her, certainly not in the same way it mattered to Edward Bloom and his daughter by proxy. She ushered him inside the dark but cosy tavern and made him sit as her husband, a man just as old but sturdily built, took Will's bags up to his room. With a half-toothless smile, the innkeeper's wife brought him a glass of plum brandy and a letter. Will drank the brandy, finding it more than agreeable, and opened the missive when she'd left his table. "My friend, welcome to the Carpathians. I am anxiously expecting you. Sleep well tonight. At 7 tomorrow the diligence will start for Bukovina. A place on it is kept for you. At the Borgo Pass, my carriage will await you and bring you to me. I trust that your journey from London has been a happy one, and that you will enjoy your stay in my beautiful land. Your friend, Count Hannibal Lecter." Bram Stoker's Hannibal, written by D.B. Mars, read by Fanfarin. Chapter 3. The Dead Travel Fast. Despair weighed him down like a blanket of heavy snow, cold and bitter and fiercely pale. He raised his hand to his face and wiped the tears away, then stepped up to the latticed window, unlatching the casement and swinging it open. Far below, beneath the castle wall and a steep cliff, was the river. It was deep, and the current was strong, he knew. He had thought perhaps the waters would reflect the blush of this final sunset, but they were black. Nightmare waters, revealing only the termination of pain, but no further comfort. He stepped out of the window and onto the narrow stone ledge, teetering on the edge of the precipice. Let it all end. There was no reason to continue, not for all the earthly pleasures or eternal punishments. Nothing mattered now that he was gone. The old song spoke of heartbreak, of people falling victim to it just as they might die of the plague or an arrow to the throat. He'd never understood it, never truly believed it until now. There is a reason why things are as they are. Will turned his head. A woman stood on the ledge next to him, dressed in the poor, ragged clothes of London street folk. She gave him a tired smile. Polly Nichols. He tried to speak, but found his voice dried up in his throat. Suddenly, Polly's placid, accepting expression twisted, contorting into a grimace of pain. Blood soaked through her dress, staining all up and down her chest. With a groan, she fell, plummeting headfirst down into the steep crevasse towards the ominous ribbon of river. Abel Gideon stepped out onto the ledge, a bloody knife in his hand. "And what did you see with my eyes and know with my knowledge? You had perhaps better understand, Inspector." "I don't want to see," Will pleaded, or tried to. His words were barely whispers forced from his lungs. "See? See?" They reached for one another at the same time with the same motion, as though they were twinned reflections in a mirror, the glass and sheen of silver separating them. And then they were falling. Will woke up, sitting up so fast he heard his spine crack in several places. The innkeeper's wife was knocking on the door. "I'm up," he called roughly, and she went away, muttering under her breath in Romanian. Will leaned over and picked up his pocket watch, flipping open the cover. It was almost a full hour later than he'd asked to be awakened. "Figures," he growled, getting up to dress as quickly as possible. The Golden Crone's innkeeper and his wife had proven to be of dubious reliability. Will supposed it could be a cultural difference and was willing to accommodate, but it still struck him as strange. No one thus far on the journey had acted the way that they had last night. After reading Count Lecter's letter the previous evening, Will had tried asking the innkeeper about the details concerning his reserved seat on the coach. The man had suddenly decided he didn't understand German, when up until that very moment Will had been able to communicate with him without issue. The woman was the same way. The pair kept glancing at one another, brief, sidelong looks that Will read easily, without activating the sixth sense in his mind that allowed him to enter the emotions and perspectives of others. They were afraid of something. Perhaps they'd skimmed some of Count Lecter's money off the top and he wasn't to have the requested seat. Not that he cared much. Will prodded, asking if the innkeepers knew anything of Count Lecter or his castle, or the village near it known as Chebrul Negru. They insisted they knew nothing at all, and refused to speak further, indicating they had work to do. Will noticed the old woman furiously crossing herself as she went back into the kitchen. Now, here she was at his door again, this time with a laden breakfast tray, sausages and more of the corn mash, bread, jam and a pot of tea. "Eat, you must eat, young hare," she said as Will hurriedly packed his things. Will paused, only to pour himself a cup of tea and bolt it down. "Madam," he said in brusque German, stuffing his journal into his coat pocket, "why don't you want me on that coach?" She stared at him, wringing her wrinkled hands. "Clearly you woke me later than I asked, so I might not catch it in time." He could feel the ambient pulse in his head whirring to life even as he actively tried to ignore it, the golden pendulum waiting in the wings. He could feel the woman's emotions and motivation sink into his mind like a boat taking on water. "You don't know me from Adam, so why are you afraid for me?" He plopped down on the bed to tie his boots, waiting for an answer. "Don't you know what day it is?" She followed him to the other side of the small room where he busily packed up his writing things. "May 4th, Will snapped. "Thursday." "No, young hare, it is St. George's Day. Tonight, between midnight and dawn, all the evil creatures on earth will gather the power they need to bedevil God-fearing folk all year round." He stopped and turned to her, shouldering his satchel. "Your German has suddenly improved." "Please," she begged, snatching at his coat as he brushed past her into the hallway. "If you talked like this in London, they'd lock you up." The old woman's mouth contorted, and she began to cry. Will mentally kicked himself, but found that softest returned to his bearing. "I'm sorry if I speak..." He tried to remember the word in German. "I was rude. Forgive me. I have business that needs to be done." "So young and handsome," she said between sniffles. "I fear for you. Please, take this." She withdrew a blue-beaded rosary from her pocket. "Madam..." "Please, take it," she insisted tearfully. "For your mother's sake." Will felt his body stiffen and his heart go dark like the cold edge of a winter moon. "For my mother's sake." She nodded miserably. "My mother," he said, "abandoned me." "No, no," the woman protested as he turned to walk down the hall to the staircase. "No, how could she? Please, take it, take it." She had a hold of his coat now. Will swallowed down a curse and stopped, holding out his hand. The woman opened the rosary and insisted on draping it around his neck. "God keep you, sweet boy," she cried, crossing herself again. He bit his tongue against the urge to tell her that he was past 30. Instead, he hurried out to catch his coach. The innkeeper was there, speaking with the coachman in hushed tones, making no attempt to conceal that they were whispering about him. He caught several Romanian words as he approached, strigoi, moroi, pokol, vrolok, but didn't know offhand what they meant. Will tossed his bag at the coachman and climbed stubbornly aboard the conveyance. The coachman responded by freeing one hand to raise his index and smallest finger towards Will. He'd seen it enough times when working for the Metropolitan Police. The gesture was a ward against the evil eye. Will wanted to be irritated with them, with everyone trying to sabotage his journey to visit Count Lecter and sell him property in London. It made him feel like he was back home, still, after 5 years, having his name recognised, people asking him if he was related to the Will Graham that caught Jack the Ripper. Some even knew his face from the sketches done by Winifred Lowndes for her Tattle Crime column. They either treated him like a hero, or asked him for grisly, offensive details about the victims and the crime scenes. It was attention he didn't want, never wanted. But these people in Romania had no idea who he was, and for some reason they didn't want him continuing to the Borgo Pass. Perhaps Count Lecter was less than well loved in the region, and these people didn't want him to have the properties he desired. On the other hand, perhaps they knew he planned to buy London homes and didn't want him to move away. As the coach bounced along the country roads, Will let his mind gather all the pieces of information, all the words and interactions of the innkeepers and the coachman, and let them coalesce in the part of his mind that gave him access to the minds of others. The ambient pulse sliced across his vision as he closed his eyes. These people were afraid for his safety, pure and simple. They knew something about Count Lecter, or the surrounding area of his castle, that Will did not know. Or they thought they knew it, and it was something they could not name or give voice to, lest it grow in power or significance. Along the route, the coach stopped at several smaller villages and picked up or dropped off passengers. Some of them attempted to make conversation, but Will, after curtly answering their questions, made it clear he wasn't interested in talking. As the Count had promised, he had a good seat, in the back facing forward next to the small window, and Will let himself be lost again in the beauty of the landscape. It was a green, sloping land full of forests and woods, peppered intermittently with steep hills, crowned with clumps of trees or farmhouses. The blank gable end to the road. Everywhere were bewilderingly lovely masses of fruit blossoms, and, depending on the wind, the scent wafted into the coach, an improvement over the human body smells of the passengers. Apple, plum, pear, cherry, the green grass under the trees spangled with fallen petals. The road ran between the hills, sweeping around the grassy curves, touching upon the straggling ends of pine woods, which here and there ran down the hillsides like tongues of flame. The road was rugged, but still the coachman flew over it with a feverish haste, calling sharply to passengers at the stops to enter or exit the coach as quickly as they could. The man's general grumpiness finally got on Will's nerves as he argued hotly with a passenger trying to climb aboard with a small dog. It was a mutt of no discernible breed, but the shaggy little brown and white creature reminded Will of Neil Frank's dog, Allegra. Will stuck his head out of the window opening and called up in harsh German, "Let him on! Nobody cares about the dog, I'm sure it's trained." He didn't know if he spoke for the other passengers. He didn't give a damn. The coachman seemed to be reminded of his need for haste, and urged the man with the dog to climb aboard. He sat across from Will and gave him a smile and a nod of thanks. The dog was, as Will predicted, very well behaved, and sat patiently on the man's lap as they bounced along the rustic road. Will reached out his hand, but stopped, looking at the man with silent question. He nodded, and Will stroked the dog's velvety ears. She panted happily and licked his palm. Her owner said something in Romanian that Will didn't understand. He shook his head ruefully. "Do you speak German?" The man shrugged with a rueful laugh of his own. The dog might have been the spitting image of Allegra, but her owner was the opposite of Neil, fair-haired and ruddy-cheeked, sturdy in body where Neil had been slender. The only thing they had in common, it seemed, was their ages, close to Will's, both handsome, but for different reasons. Will thought the association would hurt, thinking of the man who had courted him during his first year as a bobby, but it came nowhere close to the pain of Alana's rejection. He and Neil had had some good times, and he would fondly remember their end-of-shift encounters in the back room of their favourite tavern. But he hadn't loved Neil, and when Neil had gotten engaged to a successful doctor and quit the force, Will had wished him well. In truth, he missed the dog more than he did his former paramour. Beyond the green swelling hills rose mighty slopes of forest up the lofty steeps of the Carpathian Mountains. Right and left they towered, with the afternoon sun falling full upon them and bringing out all of the glorious colours of the range, deep blue and purple in the shadows of the peaks, green and brown here grass and rock mingled, and an endless swathe of jagged rock and pointed crags, till those themselves were lost in the distance, where the snowy peaks rose grandly. Here and there were mighty rifts in the mountains, through which, as the sun began to sink, Will saw the white gleam of falling water. As the coach wound on its endless way, and the sun sank lower and lower, the shadows of the evening began to creep around them. This was emphasized, Will thought, by the fact that the snowy mountain top still held the sunset, and seemed to glow out with a delicate cool pink. The next village was small indeed, a gathering of warm lights in the crook of land before a great pine forest. This was where the man with the dog left them. He took a moment to thank Will again, and wiggled his dog's paw in a little wave as the carriage rolled away. Will lifted a hand in goodbye. With the loss of the sun, the springtime sweetness of the day was gone. The air was cold, and the growing twilight seemed to merge into one dark mistiness, the gloom of the trees, and Will spotted late-lying snow on the ground. Sometimes the road cut through the pine woods that seemed in the darkness to be closing upon the coach, great masses of greyness. As true darkness descended, Will could feel the anxiety of the driver, and the remaining passengers ratchet up several more notches. One woman pounded her fist against the side of the coach and hollered some words that Will guessed urged the driver to go faster. The driver lashed the horses unmercifully with his long whip, to the point where Will didn't think he could take it anymore. He thought furtively of the revolver packed in his satchel, of whether he would need to use it to force the driver to stop beating the animals. He was surrounded by the insistent fear of the passengers and the driver, their agitation bleeding into his bones, and felt he could do nothing but lower his head and clench his hands over the satchel in his lap. The road suddenly grew more level, and the coach flew along this straight stretch. The mountains seemed to come nearer on each side and frown down upon them. Will knew from the maps he'd studied they were entering, at last, the Borgo Pass. There were dark, rolling clouds overhead, and the air held the heavy, oppressive sense of thunder. It seemed as though the mountain range had separated two atmospheres, and this one was swollen with the threat of rain. The driver at last pulled the horses to a stop at the crossroads. The passengers all stared at Will, their eyes fever-bright with fear or soft with pity. "What is it?" He couldn't stop himself from asking, blurting it out in English. "What's the matter with all of you?" The passengers looked at one another, but remained mute. The driver was at the window. "There is no carriage here," he said in his accented German, swiping a hand along his thick black moustache. "The Herr is not expected after all. He will now come on to Bukowina and return tomorrow, or the next day. Better the next day." The other passengers nodded and agreed with solemn enthusiasm. "Weißt du denn?" Will demanded, switching back to German once he'd gathered his wits enough to do so. His empty stomach was burning, and felt bile rising in the back of his throat. An innkeeper and his wife acting strangely about Count Lecter was one thing, but an entire coach full of people was another. Was it superstition or folk legend, like the ones about men that changed into wolves, or the walking dead that he'd read about before making this journey? If so, they all believed it, at the core of their souls. His empathetic connection understood they were genuinely afraid, and didn't want him to get out of the coach. Before anyone could answer, the coach's horses began to neigh and snort and plunge wildly, so that the driver had to grab at their bridles to steady them. Then, from the misty gloom, a caleche, with 4 horses, appeared from the northern path. By the dim light of the half-moon and the coach's lamps, Will could see that the horses were coal-black and splendid animals. They were driven by a woman, her small frame contained in a large black coat with a high, stiff collar, the cuffs edged in rough grey fur. Will's mind acknowledged that she was beautiful, but overriding this recognition was the startling appearance of her eyes, almond-shaped and dark, yet somehow gleaming with an uncanny brightness. The black horses slowed to a stop with barely a touch of the reins. The woman spoke to the driver, and her voice had the clear calmness of a still pond. "You are early." An old woman in the coach crossed herself and pressed a rosary into her chest, squeezing her eyes shut tight. "It is she," the spotted lips whispered. "The Sentinel." If you enjoyed this podfic and would like to listen to more, as there is much more available and much more to come, then you can find me as Fanfarron on AO3, or if you'd just like to read the fic, you can find it with DB Mars on AO3, and I'll link these on social media with this episode, as well as in the episode description. Fate and Circumstance is an independent podcast brought to you by Felix Fanfarron Fern, Melissa Susan, and Shira Bambi. You can find and follow us on Twitter and Tumblr at Hannibal Pod. We are fans of the show NBC's Hannibal and do not own the rights to any of the materials discussed, merely appreciators. The music used in this podcast is Tchaikovsky's Op. No. 40 Waltz by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0 license. Thanks for listening.